Imagine living in a time when the absolute biggest superpower the world had ever seen was slowly, completely falling apart. I mean, the whole social structure of the Roman Empire was just fracturing, leaving countless vulnerable people completely out in the cold. But here's the crazy part. Right in the middle of this crumbling civilization, a completely different kind of society was actually thriving. And no, it wasn't built on military might or massive treasuries, it was built on this fascinating historical reality, a completely decentralized social safety net. Today, we're going to explore exactly how early Christians constructed this intricate architecture of voluntary charity that literally outlasted the failing Roman Empire. We're breaking down the mechanics of a system they called pure religion and looking at how it completely shifted the paradigm of human survival and community.
So, let's dive right into this architecture of charity. We are going to be covering 1. Defining pure religion, 2. The daily ministration, 3. The network of tens, 4. Rejecting legal charity, 5. Reimagining the minister, and finally 6. A temple of living stones.
All right, Section 1. Defining pure religion.
Now, to really understand this system, we have to understand its driving concept. When we look at the historical record, pure religion wasn't just some abstract set of spiritual beliefs. Not at all. It was a highly practical, totally decentralized social safety net. And here is the absolute historical fact of the matter. It functioned exclusively on voluntary charity and free will offerings. They strictly, and I mean strictly, avoided government-mandated welfare. Every single thing was driven by the willing hearts of the people, contributing their own resources by choice rather than relying on some coercive state apparatus to redistribute wealth for them. It was literally a radical experiment in absolute voluntarism.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the daily ministration. So, let's look at how this actually translated into action on the ground with what they called the daily ministration. This wasn't just some sporadic, once-a-year holiday charity drive. No, this was a consistent, highly practical pipeline of resources flowing directly from the community straight to the most vulnerable members, primarily widows and orphans, who, remember, had literally no other means of support back in the ancient world. And again, this was exclusively funded by the charitable contributions of the believers themselves. To make sure these resources actually reached the people who needed them, without all the corruption or massive overhead, it was managed by appointed individuals. These were the called-out ministers, known as the ecclesia. They basically functioned as the on-the-ground logistical facilitators for this massive charitable effort.
Which brings us to Section 3, the network of tens. Now, what's really fascinating here is how they actually scaled this thing globally. Because you can't just throw a bunch of resources into a giant pot and just hope they somehow get to the right people, right? Instead, they used this incredibly innovative organizational tactic. It was a scaling architecture. It started at the absolute micro level, small, tightly interconnected groups of tens, literally just families taking care of families. Then, those small groups linked up into cohesive networks of hundreds. And then, those hundreds connected to form huge, global, international networks of thousands. It's like a giant puzzle, a fractal structure. This meant that while the actual sharing of resources remained house to house and deeply personal locally, it actually built this incredibly resilient, interconnected society that spanned across vast geographic regions.
And to really put that into perspective, let's look at a historical stress test of this exact system. Back in the year 44 CE, the severe economic depression and famine absolutely slammed the region of Jerusalem. The local community was totally devastated. But because of that decentralized structure we just talked about, the International Faith Network instantly activated. Between 45 and 47 CE, believers in entirely different countries, people who had never even met the folks in Jerusalem, they pulled their voluntary offerings. And by 48 CE, those resources were successfully deployed across borders to completely relieve this localized crisis. It absolutely proved that a completely voluntary decentralized system could organize international disaster relief way faster and way more effectively than the massive, clunky empires around them.
Section 4. Rejecting legal charity. Because of the massive success of their own system, early Christians actually actively refused to apply for state-run welfare. It was a major ideological clash. On one hand, you have their system, free will offerings, totally rooted in choice. On the other hand, you have what they called legal charity. This included stuff like the famous free bread of Rome, the massive welfare system that kept the Roman populace pacified, as well as the Corban of the Pharisees, which was a mandated statutory welfare system. So why reject free bread? Well, they viewed these state-run systems as fundamentally flawed. Why? Because they were funded by exercising authority to take from neighbors through taxation and coercion. To these early Christians, mandating wealth redistribution by force wasn't charity. It was actually a form of covetousness and idolatry. They firmly believed that true charity could only exist when it was freely given, not legally extracted from people.
Section 5. Reimagining the minister.
So the really crucial point here is understanding who was actually facilitating this massive network. Let's contrast the power structures of the time directly. Look at the civil rulers. Their whole approach to power was exercising authority and absolute dominion over people, right? Their core function was managing coercive state resources. Now look at the Christian ministers, the ecclesia. They were strictly prohibited from exercising dominion. They literally could not force anyone to pay into the system. Their core function was facilitating what they called the Eucharist. And it is absolutely vital to understand that for them, the Eucharist wasn't just some symbolic ritual. It was viewed as a literal daily ministration of thanksgiving where actual real resources, food and aid were shared from house to house. These ministers were true public servants. They were serving the public's voluntary generosity, not ruling over them.
All right, Section 6, a temple of living stones. All of these mechanics, all of this incredible organization, it culminated in a community that functioned as, quote, a temple of living stones, where social bonds were fed by the perfect law of liberty and love. By choosing this incredibly demanding, yet entirely voluntary path, they managed to remain completely unspotted from the world. So when the heavy, top-down, coercive structures of the Roman Empire inevitably crumbled under their own weight and corruption, this network of living stones didn't fall with it. They actually thrived. Their alternative society was held together not by the threat of Roman swords, but by unbreakable social bonds of liberty, mutual love, and daily practical charity.
Which brings us to a really provocative question. What kind of architecture are you building in your community today? Are we relying on those same top-down coercive systems? Or are we actively weaving local, voluntary networks of care and liberty? I really want you to think deeply about that. Listen, if this explainer sparks something for you, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share so we can keep spreading these crucial historical insights. Also, I highly suggest you check out the incredibly detailed source article on this topic. You're going to find that link right down in the description. And finally, if you're ready to actually put these ancient principles into practice today, I invite you to join the living network of seekers for God's kingdom. The link to connect with that network is also right there in the description below. Thank you so much for hanging out with us and keep building those living stones.